Mike ɡrə́vɛl. Maurice Robert. Mike ɡrə́vɛl is an American politician who served as a United States Senator from Alaska from 1969 to 1981. A member of the Democratic Party, he unsuccessfully ran as a candidate in the 2008 U.S. presidential election and as candidate in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts, by French-Canadian immigrant parents, ɡrə́vɛl served in the U.S. Army in West Germany, and later graduated from the Columbia University School of General Studies. He moved to Alaska in the late 1950s, becoming a real estate developer and entering politics. He served in the Alaska House of Representatives from 1963 to 1966 and also became Speaker of the Alaska House. ɡrə́vɛl was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1968. As a senator, ɡrə́vɛl became nationally known for his forceful but unsuccessful attempts to end the draft during the war in Vietnam and for putting the Pentagon Papers into the public record in 1971 at some risk to himself. He conducted an unusual campaign for the Democratic nomination in 1972 for Vice President of the United States, and then played a crucial role in getting congressional approval for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 1973. He was re-elected to the Senate in 1974, but gradually alienated his Alaskan constituents, and his bid for a third term was defeated in a primary election in 1980. ɡrə́vɛl returned to business ventures and went through difficult times, suffering corporate and personal bankruptcies amid poor health. He has been an advocate of direct democracy and the national initiative. In 2006, ɡrə́vɛl began a run for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States to promote those ideas. His campaign gained an internet following and national attention due to forceful, humorous, and politically unorthodox debate appearances during 2007, but he found very little support in national polls or the 2008 caucuses and primaries. In March 2008 he left the Democratic Party and joined the Libertarian Party to compete for its presidential nomination and the inclusion of the national initiative into the Libertarian platform. At the Libertarian National Convention of 2008 he failed on both counts. He subsequently became an executive for a marijuana products company and continued to speak out about various political issues and candidates. ɡrə́vɛl filed to run for president on April 2, 2019. On July 31, his campaign announced that he was dropping out of the race. Early life, military service, education. ɡrə́vɛl was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, one of 5 children of French-Canadian immigrant parents, Alphonse and Marie ɡrə́vɛl. His parents were part of the Quebec diaspora, and he was raised in a working-class neighborhood during the Great Depression, speaking only French until he was 7 years old. Calling him Mike from an early age, his father valued work above all else, while his mother stressed the importance of education. ɡrə́vɛl was educated in parochial schools as a Roman Catholic. There he struggled, due to what he later said was undiagnosed dyslexia, and was left back in 3rd grade. He completed elementary school in 1945 and his class voted him most charming personality. A summer job as a soda jerk led to ɡrə́vɛl handing out campaign flyers for local candidates on his boss's behalf. ɡrə́vɛl was immediately impressed with the awesomeness of political office. ɡrə́vɛl then boarded at Assumption Preparatory School in Worcester, Massachusetts, where his performance was initially mediocre. Then an English teacher, the Assumptionist Edgar Bork, gave him personal attention, improving ɡrə́vɛl's language skills and instructing him in public speaking. ɡrə́vɛl's grades improved measurably in his final year and he graduated in 1949. He has a sister, Marguerite, who became a Holy Cross nun, but ɡrə́vɛl himself struggled with the Catholic faith. He studied for 1 year at Assumption College, a Catholic school in Worcester, then transferred for his sophomore year to American International College in Springfield. Journalist I.F. Stone and philosopher Bertrand Russell strongly influenced ɡrə́vɛl in their willingness to challenge assumptions and oppose social convention and political authority. Around May 1951, ɡrə́vɛl saw that he was about to be drafted and instead enlisted in the U.S. Army for a 3-year term so that he could get into the counterintelligence corps. After basic training and counterintelligence school at Fort Holabird in Maryland and in South Carolina, he went to officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. While he expected to be sent off to the Korean War when he graduated as a second lieutenant in early 1952, he was instead assigned to Stuttgart, West Germany, as a special adjutant in the Army's Communications Intelligence Service. There he had an adventurous time moving around the country, conducting surveillance operations on civilians, and paying off spies. After about a year he transferred to Orléans, France, where his French language abilities allowed him to infiltrate French communist rallies. He worked as a special agent in the Counterintelligence Corps until 1954, eventually becoming a first lieutenant. Following his discharge, ɡrə́vɛl entered the Columbia University School of General Studies in New York City, where he studied economics and received a B.S. in 1956. He moved to New York, flat broke, and supported himself by working as a bar boy in a hotel, driving a taxicab, and working in the investment bond department at Bankers Trust. During this time he left the Catholic religion. Moved to Alaska. ɡrə́vɛl decided to become a pioneer in a faraway place, and moved to pre-statehood Alaska in August 1956, without funds or a job, looking for a place where someone without social or political connections could be a viable candidate for public office. Alaska's voting age of 19, less than most other states' 21, played a role in his decision, as did its newness and cooler climate. Broke when he arrived, he immediately found work in real estate sales until winter arrived. ɡrə́vɛl then was employed as a brakeman for the Alaska Railroad, working the snow-clearing train on the Anchorage-Fairbanks run. Subsequently, he opened a small real estate brokerage in Anchorage and saved enough so as not to have to work the railroad again. The firm was named the Mr. ɡrə́vɛl Real Estate Company. ɡrə́vɛl joined the Anchorage Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and would continue a sporadic relationship with the movement throughout his life. Seeing Alaska as a wide-open place with no political establishment or entrenched interests, ɡrə́vɛl quickly became part of the civic scene there. By October 1957 he was a division chairman for Anchorage for the Democratic Central Committee in the territory, and by June 1958 he was president of the Alaska Young Democrats organization. He also became active in the United States Junior Chamber, and by early 1958 his duties included handing out awards for Farmer of the Year. By early 1958, ɡrə́vɛl was running as Democratic Party primary candidate for a 3rd Division seat in House of Representative of the territorial legislature. Using the slogan, ɡrə́vɛl, the roadbed to prosperity, he ran but lost. At the same time, he was also an advocate for Alaskan statehood. ɡrə́vɛl went on a 44-state national speaking tour concerning tax reform in 1959, sponsored by the Jaycees, and often dressing as Paul Revere. ɡrə́vɛl was selected from some 2,000 applications for this position. The tour received a good amount of local newspaper coverage at its various stops, with ɡrə́vɛl's first name sometimes given as Mike and other times as Maurice. The tour's general message was an urging of lower taxes, more efficiency in government and a system of taxation moderate at all levels of income. At several stops ɡrə́vɛl stated that the tide of socialism had to be stopped. He elaborated at another stop, "It is part of our JC creed that economic justice can best be won by free men through free enterprise. We really want to see that free enterprise become our inheritance." The tour was scheduled to conclude in Washington, D.C., on Tax Day, April 15, with petition signatures accumulated for reform to be presented to U.S. lawmakers. Dressed as Revere, ɡrə́vɛl rode with the petition to the steps of the U.S. Capitol. The tour over, ɡrə́vɛl married Rita Jeanette Martin at the First Methodist Church of Anchorage on April 29, 1959. She was a native of Montana who had attended Billings Business College before moving to Alaska 2 years prior and becoming a secretary in the office of the Anchorage city manager. She had also been named Anchorage's Miss Fur Rendezvous of 1958. They would have 2 children, Martin Anthony ɡrə́vɛl and Lynn Denise ɡrə́vɛl, born c. 1960 and 1962 respectively. ɡrə́vɛl ran without avail for the city council in Anchorage in 1960. During this time, he had become a successful real estate agent. After the 1960 election, he became a property developer in a mobile home park on the outskirts of Anchorage. After a partner ran into financial difficulty, however, the project went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and ɡrə́vɛl was forced out in 1962. State legislator with the support of Alaska wholesale grocer Barney Gottstein and supermarket builder Larry Carr, ɡrəʻvɛl ran for the Alaska House of Representatives representing Anchorage in 1962, initially assigned the 10th and then 8th districts. Alaska had very crowded primaries that year. ɡrəʻvɛl was one of 33 Democrats, along with 21 Republicans, who were running for the chance to compete for the 14 House seats allocated to the 8th district. ɡrəʻvɛl made it through the primary, and in November 8 Republicans and 6 Democrats were elected to the House from the district, with ɡrəʻvɛl finishing 8th overall and 3rd among with Democrats, with 8,174 votes. Gottstein became ɡrəʻvɛl's main financial backer during most of his subsequent campaigns. ɡrəʻvɛl served in the Alaska House of Representatives from January 28, 1963 to January 22, 1967, winning re-election in 1964. In his first term, he served as a minority member on 2 House committees, Commerce, and Labor and Management. He co-authored and sponsored the act that created the Alaska State Commission for Human Rights. ɡrəʻvɛl was the chief architect of the law that created a regional high school system for rural Alaska. This allowed Alaska Natives to attend schools near where they lived instead of having to go to schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the lower 48 states. During the half years that the legislature was not in session, ɡrəʻvɛl resumed his real estate work. With Gottstein and Carr's backing, he became quite successful as a property developer on the Kenai Peninsula. During 1965 and 1966, he served as the Speaker of the House, surprising observers by winning that post. ɡrəʻvɛl convinced former Speaker Warren A. Taylor to not try for the position against him by promising Taylor chairmanship of the Rules Committee, then reneged on the promise. ɡrəʻvɛl denied later press charges that he had promised but not delivered on other committee chairmanships. As Speaker, he antagonized fellow lawmakers by imposing his will on the legislature's committees and feuded with Alaska State Senate President Robert J. McNeely. ɡrəʻvɛl did not run for re-election in 1966, instead choosing to run for Alaska's seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, losing the primary to 4-term incumbent Democrat Ralph Rivers by 1,300 votes and splitting the Democratic Party in the process. Rivers lost the general election that year to Republican State Senator Howard Wallace Pollock. Following his defeat, ɡrəʻvɛl returned to the real estate business in Anchorage. U.S. Senator election to Senate in 1968. In 1968 he ran against the 81-year-old incumbent Democratic Senator Ernest Gruening, a popular former governor of the Alaska Territory who was considered one of the fathers of Alaska's statehood. For his party's nomination to the U.S. Senate, ɡrəʻvɛl's campaign was primarily based on his youth rather than issue differences. He hired Joseph Napolitan, the first self-described political consultant, in late 1966. They spent over a year and a half planning a short, 9-day primary election campaign that featured the slogans, Alaska First, and Let's Do Something About the State We're In, the distribution of a collection of essays titled Jobs and More Jobs, and the creation of a half-hour, well-produced, glamorized biographical film of ɡrəʻvɛl, Man for Alaska. The film was shown twice a day on every television station in Alaska, and carried by plane and shown on home projectors in hundreds of Alaska Native villages. The heavy showings quickly reversed a 2-to-1 Gruening lead in polls into a ɡrəʻvɛl lead. ɡrəʻvɛl visited many remote villages by seaplane and showed a thorough understanding of the needs of the bush country and the fishing and oil industries. He also benefited by being deliberately ambiguous about his Vietnam policy. Gruening had been one of only 2 senators to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and his opposition to President Lyndon B. Johnson's war policies was harming him among the Democratic electorate. According to ɡrəʻvɛl, all I had to do was stand up and not deal with the subject, and people would assume that I was to the right of Ernest Gruening, when in point of fact I was to the left of him. In Man for Alaska, ɡrəʻvɛl argued that the Liberals would come to West Germany's defense if it was attacked, and that the same standard should apply to the United States allies in Asia. During the campaign he also claimed that he was more in the mainstream of American thought on Vietnam than Gruening, despite the fact that he had written to Gruening to praise his anti-war stance 4 years earlier. ɡrəʻvɛl beat Gruening in the primary by about 2,000 votes. Gruening found the unexpected defeat hard to take, and thought that some aspects of his opponent's biographical film had misled viewers. In the general election, ɡrəʻvɛl faced Republican Elmer E. Rasmussen, a banker and former mayor of Anchorage. College students in the state implored Gruning to run a write-in campaign as an independent, but legal battles prevented him from getting approval for it until only 2 weeks were left. A late appearance by anti-war presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy did not offset Gruning's lack of funds and endorsements. Meanwhile, ɡrəʻvɛl and Rasmussen both saturated local media with their filmed biographies. On November 5, 1968, ɡrəʻvɛl won the general election with 45% of the vote to Rasmussen's 37% and Gruning's 18%. Senate assignments and style. When ɡrəʻvɛl joined the Senate in January 1969, he requested and received a seat on the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, which had direct relevance to Alaskan issues. He also got a spot on the Public Works Committee, which he held throughout his time in the Senate. Finally, he was a member of the Select Committee on Small Business. In 1971 he became chair of the Public Works Committee's subcommittee on Public Buildings and Grounds, and by 1973 he was chair of its subcommittee on Water Resources, then later its subcommittee on Environmental Pollution. ɡrəʻvɛl was also initially named to the Joint Committee on Congressional Operations. By 1973 ɡrəʻvɛl was off the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee and the Select Small Business Committee and instead a member of the Finance Committee, and by 1977 was chair of that body's subcommittee on energy and foundations. By 1973 he had also been on the ad hoc special committee to study secret and confidential government documents. By his own admission, ɡrəʻvɛl was too new and too abrasive to be effective in the Senate by the usual means of seniority-based committee assignments or negotiating deals with other senators, and was sometimes seen as arrogant by the more senior members. He instead relied on attention-getting gestures to achieve what he wanted, hoping national exposure would force other senators to listen to him. As part of this he voted with Southern Democrats to keep the Senate filibuster rule in place, and accordingly supported Russell Long and Robert Byrd but opposed Ted Kennedy in Senate leadership battles. In retrospective assessment, University of Alaska Anchorage history professor Stephen Haycox said, "Loose cannon is a good description of ɡrəʻvɛl's Senate career. He was an off-the-wall guy, and you weren't really ever sure what he would do." Nuclear issues and the Cold War. In the late 1960s and early 1970s the U.S. Department of Defense was in the process of performing tests for the nuclear warhead for the Spartan anti-ballistic missile. 2 tests, the Milrow and Kannakin tests, were planned, involving the detonation of nuclear bombs under Amchitka Island in Alaska. The Milrow test would be a 1 megaton calibration exercise for the second and larger 5 megaton Kannakin test, which would measure the effectiveness of the warhead. ɡrəʻvɛl opposed the tests. Before the Milrow test took place in October 1969, he wrote that there were significant risks of earthquakes and other adverse consequences and called for an independent national commission on nuclear and seismic safety. He then made a personal appeal to President Nixon to stop the test. After Milrow was conducted, there was continued pressure on the part of environmental groups against going forward with the Kannakin test, while the Federation of American Scientists claimed that the warhead being tested was already obsolete. In May 1971 ɡrəʻvɛl sent a letter to U.S. Atomic Energy Commission hearings held in Anchorage in which he said the risk of the test was not worth taking. Eventually a group not involving ɡrəʻvɛl took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to issue an injunction against it, and the Kannakin test took place as scheduled in November 1971. ɡrəʻvɛl had failed to stop the tests. In 1971 ɡrəʻvɛl voted against the Nixon administration's proposed anti-ballistic missile system, the Safeguard Program, having previously vacillated over the issue, suggesting that he might be willing to support it in exchange for federal lands in Alaska being opened up for private oil drilling. His vote alienated Senator Henry "Scoop" Jackson, who had raised funds for ɡrəʻvɛl's primary campaign. Nuclear power was considered an environmentally clean alternative for commercial generation of electricity and was part of a popular national policy for the peaceful use of atomic energy in the 1950s and 1960s. ɡrəʻvɛl publicly opposed this policy. Besides the dangers of nuclear testing, he was a vocal critic of the Atomic Energy Commission, which oversaw American nuclear efforts, and of the powerful United States Congress Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which had a stranglehold on nuclear policy and which ɡrəʻvɛl tried to circumvent. In 1971, ɡrə́vɛl sponsored a bill to impose a moratorium on nuclear power plant construction and to make power utilities liable for any nuclear accidents. In 1975 he was still proposing similar moratoriums. By 1974 ɡrə́vɛl was allied with Ralph Nader's organization in opposing nuclear power. 6 months before U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's July 1971 secret mission to the People's Republic of China, ɡrə́vɛl introduced legislation to recognize and normalize relations with China, including a proposal for unity talks between the PRC and the Republic of China regarding the Chinese seat on the UN Security Council. He reiterated his position in favor of recognition, with 4 other senators in agreement, during Senate hearings in June 1971. Vietnam War, the draft, and the Pentagon Papers. Although he did not campaign against the Vietnam War during his first Senate campaign, by the end of 1970 ɡrə́vɛl was speaking out against United States policy in Southeast Asia. In December of that year he persuaded William Fulbright to join him in a spontaneous 2-day filibuster against a $155 million military aid package to Cambodia's Khmer Republic government in the Cambodian Civil War. President Richard Nixon had campaigned in 1968 on a promise to end the U.S. military draft, a decision endorsed by the February 1970 report of the Gates Commission. The existing draft law was scheduled to conclude at the end of June 1971, and the Senate faced a contentious debate about whether to extend it as the Vietnam War continued. The Nixon administration announced in February 1971 that it wanted a 2-year extension to June 1973, after which the draft would end. Army planners had already been operating under the assumption of a 2-year extension, after which an all-volunteer force would be in place. Skeptics such as Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John Stennis thought this unrealistic and wanted a 4-year extension, but the 2-year proposal is what went forward in Congress. By early May 1971, ɡrə́vɛl had indicated his intention to filibuster the draft renewal legislation, halting conscription and thereby bringing U.S. involvement in the war to a rapid end. During this period he also supported efforts to mobilize and influence public opinion against the war, endorsing the Vietnam War Out Now rallies in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco on April 24, 1971, and financing a broadcast campaign by the anti-war group War No More with a personal loan. In June 1972 he escorted a group of over 100 anti-war protesters, including psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, actress Candice Bergen, theater producer and director Joseph Papp, and medic Benjamin Spock, into the United States Capitol. The group was arrested after blocking a hallway outside the Senate chamber. By June 1971, some Democratic senators opposed to the war wanted to limit the renewal to a 1-year extension, while others wanted to end it immediately. ɡrə́vɛl reiterated that he was one of the latter, saying, "It's a senseless war, and one way to do away with it is to do away with the draft." A Senate vote on June 4 indicated majority support for the 2-year extension. On June 18 ɡrə́vɛl announced again his intention to counteract that by filibustering the renewal legislation, defending the practice against those who associated it only with blocking civil rights legislation. The first filibuster attempt failed on June 23 when, by 3 votes, the Senate voted cloture for only the 5th time since 1927. Protracted negotiations took place over House conference negotiations on the bill, revolving in large part around Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield's eventually unsuccessful amendment to tie renewal to a troop withdrawal timetable from Vietnam. During this time the draft law expired and no more were conscripted. On August 5, the Nixon administration pleaded for a renewal before the Senate went on recess, but ɡrə́vɛl blocked Stennis's attempt to limit debate, and no vote was held. Finally, on September 21, 1971, the Senate invoked cloture over ɡrə́vɛl's second filibuster attempt by 1 vote, and then passed the 2-year draft extension. ɡrə́vɛl's attempts to stop the draft had failed. Meanwhile, on June 13, 1971, the New York Times began printing large portions of the Pentagon Papers. The papers were a large collection of secret government documents and studies pertaining to the Vietnam War, of which former Defense Department analyst Daniel Ellsberg had made unauthorized copies and was determined to make public. Ellsberg had for a year and a half approached members of Congress, such as William Fulbright, George McGovern, Charles Mathias, and Pete McCloskey, about publishing the documents, on the grounds that the speech or debate clause of the Constitution would give congressional members immunity from prosecution, but all had refused. Instead, Ellsberg gave the documents to the Times. The U.S. Justice Department immediately tried to halt publication, on the grounds that the information revealed within the papers harmed the national interest. Within the next 2 weeks, a federal court injunction halted publication in the Times. The Washington Post and several other newspapers began publishing parts of the documents, with some of them also being halted by injunctions, and the whole matter went to the U.S. Supreme Court for arguments. Looking for an alternate publication mechanism, Ellsberg returned to his idea of having a member of Congress read them, and chose ɡrə́vɛl based on the latter's efforts against the draft. ɡrə́vɛl agreed where previously others had not. Ellsberg arranged for the papers to be given to ɡrə́vɛl on June 26 via an intermediary, Washington Post editor Ben Bagdikian. ɡrə́vɛl used his counterintelligence experience to choose a midnight transfer in front of the Mayflower Hotel in the center of Washington. On the night of June 29, 1971, ɡrə́vɛl attempted to read the papers on the floor of the Senate as part of his filibuster against the draft, but was thwarted when no quorum could be formed. ɡrə́vɛl instead convened a session of the Buildings and Grounds Subcommittee that he chaired. He got New York Congressman John G. Dow to testify that the war had soaked up funding for public buildings, thus making discussion of the war relevant to the committee. He began reading from the papers with the press in attendance, omitting supporting documents that he felt might compromise national security, and declaring, "It is my constitutional obligation to protect the security of the people by fostering the free flow of information absolutely essential to their democratic decision-making." He read until 1 a.m., until with tears and sobs he said that he could no longer physically continue, the previous 3 nights of sleeplessness and fear about the future having taken their toll. ɡrə́vɛl ended the session by, with no other senators present, establishing unanimous consent to insert 4,100 pages of the papers into the congressional record of his subcommittee. The following day, the Supreme Court's New York Times Co. v. United States decision ruled in favor of the newspapers, and publication in the Times and others resumed. In July 1971, Bantam Books published an inexpensive paperback edition of the papers containing the material the Times had published. ɡrə́vɛl, too, wanted to privately publish the portion of the papers he had read into the record, believing that immediate disclosure of the contents of these papers will change the policy that supports the war. After being turned down by many commercial publishers, on August 4 he reached agreement with Beacon Press, the publishing arm of the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which ɡrə́vɛl was a member. Announced on August 17 and published on October 22, 1971, this 4-volume, relatively expensive set became the Senator ɡrə́vɛl edition, which studies from Cornell University and the Annenberg Center for Communication have labeled as the most complete edition of the Pentagon Papers to be published. The ɡrə́vɛl edition was edited and annotated by Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and included an additional volume of analytical articles on the origins and progress of the war, also edited by Chomsky and Zinn. Beacon Press then was subjected to a FBI investigation. An outgrowth of this was the ɡrə́vɛl v. United States court case, which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled upon in June 1972. It held that the speech or debate clause did grant immunity to ɡrə́vɛl for his reading the papers in his subcommittee, did grant some immunity to ɡrə́vɛl's congressional aid, but granted no immunity to Beacon Press in relation to their publishing the same papers. The Senate Democratic Caucus backed ɡrə́vɛl in the case, but due to Republican opposition it did not pay ɡrə́vɛl's legal fees, leaving him owing $25,000. The events of 1971 changed ɡrə́vɛl in the following months from an obscure freshman senator to a nationally visible political figure. He became a sought-after speaker on the college circuit as well as at political fundraisers, opportunities he welcomed as lectures were the one honest way a senator has to supplement his income. But his speaking tours caused him to accrue one of the worst absentee records in the Senate. The Democratic candidates for the 1972 presidential election sought his endorsement. In January 1972, ɡrə́vɛl endorsed Maine Senator Ed Muskie, hoping that his support would help Muskie with the party's left-wing and in ethnic French-Canadian areas during the first primary contest in New Hampshire. In April 1972, ɡrəʻvɛl appeared on all three networks' nightly newscasts to decry the Nixon administration's reliance on Vietnamization by making reference to the secret National Security Study Memorandum 1 document, which stated it would take 8 to 13 years for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to defend South Vietnam. ɡrəʻvɛl made excerpts from the study public, but Senators Robert P. Griffin and William B. Saxby blocked his attempt to read NSSM-1 into the congressional record. Domestic policy. In 1970, ɡrəʻvɛl co-sponsored legislation to establish a guaranteed minimum income, entitling poor families to up to $6,300 a year. He subsequently voted for a work bonus program, which would have entitled low-income working families with dependent children if they were paying Social Security or railroad retirement taxes to a non-taxable bonus of up to 10% of their wages. ɡrəʻvɛl also supported extending Social Security to all federal employees and introduced a campaign finance reform bill in 1971 that would have enacted full disclosure of campaign financing, placed limits on large donations, media spending and individual candidate spending. Run for vice president. In 1972, ɡrəʻvɛl actively campaigned for the office of Vice President of the United States during the 1972 presidential election, announcing on June 2, 1972, over a month before the 1972 Democratic National Convention began, that he was interested in the nomination should the choice be opened up to convention delegates. Toward this end, he began soliciting delegates for their support. He was not alone in this effort, as former governor of Massachusetts Endicott Peabody had been running a quixotic campaign for the same post since the prior year. Likely presidential nominee George McGovern was in fact considering the unusual move of naming 3 or 4 acceptable vice presidential candidates and letting the delegates choose. On the convention's final day, July 14, 1972, McGovern selected and announced Senator Thomas Eagleton of Missouri as his vice presidential choice. Eagleton was unknown to many delegates and the choice seemed to smack of traditional ticket balancing considerations. Thus there were delegates willing to look elsewhere. ɡrəʻvɛl was nominated by Betty Fahrenkamp, the Democratic National Committeewoman from Alaska. He then seconded his own nomination, breaking down in tears at his own words and maybe trying to withdraw his nomination. In any case, he won 226 delegate votes, coming in third behind Eagleton and Francis "Sissy" Farenthold of Texas, in chaotic balloting that included several other candidates. ɡrəʻvɛl attracted some attention for his efforts. Writer Norman Mailer said he provided considerable excitement and was good-looking enough to have played leads in B films, while Rolling Stone correspondent Hunter S. Thompson said ɡrəʻvɛl probably said a few things that might have been worth hearing, under different circumstances. Yet the process was doubly disastrous for the Democrats. In the time consumed by nominating and seconding and all the vice presidential candidates' speeches, the attention of the delegates on the floor was lost and McGovern's speech was pushed to 3:30 a.m. The haste with which Eagleton was selected led to surprise when his past mental health treatments were revealed. He withdrew from the ticket soon after the convention, to be replaced by Sergeant Shriver. Re-election to Senate in 1974. Several years earlier, Alaska politicians had speculated that ɡrəʻvɛl would have a hard time getting both renominated and elected when his first term expired, given that he was originally elected without a base party organization and tended to focus on national rather than local issues. Nonetheless, after receiving support from national and local labor leaders, securing key earmarks, and producing another half-hour TV advertorial, in 1974 ɡrəʻvɛl was re-elected to the Senate, with 58% of the vote to 42% for Republican State Senator C.R. Lewis, who was a national officer of the John Birch Society. Second-term ɡrəʻvɛl's re-election campaign left him $65,000 to $75,000 in debt. In 1975, The Washington Post reported on a memo by his executive assistant laying out a fundraising strategy to tackle this, including raising funds from oil companies, meeting with previous donors and inquire into the governmental priorities of these people and their groups in the coming session, as well as obtaining further speaking fees to reduce his personal debt. This was followed by a number of stories about links between ɡrəʻvɛl, lobbyists and fundraisers, including one that was widely publicized in Alaska about his holding a share in a Colorado resort with 2 Washington lobbyists he was working with on land and energy legislation. ɡrəʻvɛl had been open about the investment and had opposing views to one of the lobbyists on nuclear power. In 1980, the Wall Street Journal published details about his fundraising activities, including writing to individuals and PACs in the oil industry, pledging to kill off proposals for a windfall profits tax on the sector, and traveling in the Middle East with the business partner of one of his donors to sell Alaskan land to businessmen. ɡrəʻvɛl suggested that critics of his fundraising were naive. In 1975, ɡrəʻvɛl introduced an amendment to cut the number of troops overseas by 200,000, but it was defeated on a voice vote. In September 1975, ɡrəʻvɛl was named as one of several congressional advisors to the 7th Special Session of the United Nations, which met to discuss problems related to economic development and international economic cooperation. In June 1976, ɡrəʻvɛl was the focus of a federal investigation into allegations that he was involved in a sex for vote arrangement. Congressional Staff Clerk Elizabeth Ray said that in August 1972 she had sex with ɡrəʻvɛl aboard a houseboat on the Potomac River, under the instruction of Representative Kenneth J. Gray, her boss at the time. Gray allegedly wanted to secure ɡrəʻvɛl's support for further funding for construction of the National Visitor Center in Washington, a troubled project that was under the jurisdiction of subcommittees that both members chaired. Another congressional staffer said she witnessed the boat encounter, but ɡrəʻvɛl said at the time that he had never met either of the women. ɡrəʻvɛl and Gray strongly denied that they had made any arrangement regarding legislation, and neither was ever charged with any wrongdoing. Decades later, ɡrəʻvɛl wrote that he had indeed had sex with Ray, but had not changed any votes because of it. ɡrəʻvɛl and his main financial backer, Gutstein, had a falling out in 1978, during the congressional debate over whether to allow a controversial sale of US F-15 fighter aircraft to Saudi Arabia. An ardent backer of Israel, Gutstein opposed the sale and asked ɡrəʻvɛl to vote against it. But ɡrəʻvɛl not only voted for it but made an emotional speech attacking the anti-sale campaign. ɡrəʻvɛl wrote in 2008 that it was the only time Gutstein had ever asked him for a favor, and the rupture resulted in their never speaking to each other again. Alaskan issues. By 1971, ɡrəʻvɛl was urging construction of the much-argued Trans-Alaska Pipeline, addressing environmental concerns by saying that the pipeline's builders and operators should have total and absolute responsibility for any consequent environmental damage. 2 years later, the debate over the pipeline came to a crux, with the New York Times describing it as "environmentalists a holy war with the major oil companies." In February 1973, the U.S. Court of Appeals blocked the issuance of permits for construction. ɡrəʻvɛl and fellow Alaskan Senator Ted Stevens reacted by urging Congress to pass legislation overturning the court's decision. Environmentalists opposed to the pipeline, such as the Environmental Defense Fund and the Sierra Club, then sought to use the recently passed National Environmental Policy Act to their advantage. ɡrəʻvɛl designed an amendment to the pipeline bill that would immunize the pipeline from any further court challenges under that law, and thus speed its construction. Passage of the amendment became the key battle regarding the pipeline. On July 17, 1973, in a dramatic roll call vote, the ɡrəʻvɛl amendment was approved as a 49-49 tie was broken in favor by Vice President Spiro Agnew. The actual bill enabling the pipeline then passed easily. ɡrəʻvɛl had triumphed. In opposition to the Alaskan fishing industry, ɡrəʻvɛl advocated American participation in the formation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. For 2 years he opposed legislation that established a 200-mile exclusive economic zone for marine resources. He was one of only 19 senators to vote against Senate approval for the expanded zone in 1976, saying it would undermine the U.S. position in Law of the Sea negotiations and that nations arbitrarily extending their fishing rights limits would produce anarchy of the seas. The legislation was passed, and the United States has signed but never ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. ɡrəʻvɛl accumulated a complicated record on Indian affairs during his time in the Senate. During his first year in the Senate, ɡrəʻvɛl urged abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, criticizing the agency for the pace of development of schools in Alaska, its paternalistic attitudes and the culturally inappropriate nature of its education, and advocating greater shared decision-making between the federal government and Native communities in Alaska. Later, he evolved past this view. In the early 1970s, ɡrəʻvɛl supported a demonstration project that established links between Alaskan villages and the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, for medical diagnostic communications. In 1971, he fended off accusations from Alaskan natives that he was not spending enough time working on their land claims. ɡrəʻvɛl helped secure a private grant to facilitate the first Inuit Circumpolar Conference in 1977, attended by Inuit representatives from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. These conferences now also include representatives from Russia. In 1977, ɡrəʻvɛl helped lead an effort to have the U.S. Interior Department rename Mount McKinley to Denali. This eventually led to Denali National Park being so named. Subsequently, ɡrəʻvɛl proposed a never-built Denali city development above the Tokasitna River near the mountain, to consist of a giant Teflon dome enclosing hotels, golf courses, condominiums, and commercial buildings. A key, emotional issue in the state at the time was locking up Alaska, making reference to allocation of its vast, mostly uninhabited land. In 1978, ɡrəʻvɛl blocked passage, via procedural delays such as walking out of House-Senate Conference Committee meetings, of a complex bill which represented a compromise on land use policy. The bill would have put some of Alaska's vast federal land holdings under state control while preserving other portions for federal parks and refuges. The action would earn ɡrəʻvɛl the enmity of fellow Alaska Senator Ted Stevens. In 1980, a new lands bill came up for consideration, that was less favorable to Alaskan interests and more liked by environmentalists. It set aside 127 million acres of Alaska's 375 million acres for national parks, conservation areas, and other restricted federal uses. ɡrəʻvɛl blocked it, as not ensuring enough future development in the state. A new compromise version of the bill came forward, which reduced the land set aside to 104 million acres. Representing Alaskan interests, ɡrəʻvɛl tried to stop the bill, including by filibuster. But the Senate voted for cloture and passed the bill. Frustrated, ɡrəʻvɛl said, the legislation denies Alaska its rights as a state, and denies the U.S. crucial strategic resources, and opined that the Senate was, a little bit like a tank of barracudas. In 1978, ɡrəʻvɛl authored and secured the passage into law of the General Stock Ownership Corporation, that became Subchapter U of the Tax Code under the Internal Revenue Code of 1954. While that was originally done as a prerequisite to a failed 1980 Alaskan ballot initiative that would have paid dividends to Alaskan citizens for pipeline-related revenue, it also turned out to be significant in the development of binary economics. Loss of Senate seat in 1980. Indiana 1980, ɡrəʻvɛl was challenged for the Democratic Party's nomination by State Representative Clark Gruening, the grandson of the man ɡrəʻvɛl had defeated in a primary 12 years earlier. One of Gruening's supporters was ɡrəʻvɛl's former backer Gottstein. Several factors made ɡrəʻvɛl vulnerable. As an insurgent candidate in 1968, ɡrəʻvɛl had never established a firm party base. Not liking to hunt or fish, he was also always culturally suspect in the state. A group of Democrats, including future Governor Steve Cowper, led the campaign against ɡrəʻvɛl, with ɡrəʻvɛl's actions in respect to the 1978 and 1980 Alaskan lands bills a major issue, especially given that the latter's denouement happened but a week before the primary. The sources of ɡrəʻvɛl's campaign funds, some of which came from political action committees outside the state, also became an issue in the contest. Another factor may have been Alaska's blanket primary system of the time, which allowed unlimited voting across party lines, and from its many independents, Republicans believed Gruening would be an easier candidate to defeat in the general election. Gruening won the bitterly fought primary with about 55% of the vote to ɡrəʻvɛl's 44%. ɡrəʻvɛl later conceded that by the time of his defeat, he had alienated almost every constituency in Alaska. Gruening lost the general election to Republican Frank Murkowski. ɡrəʻvɛl was the last Democrat to represent Alaska in Congress for 28 years, until Anchorage Mayor Mark Begich defeated Stevens, by then an aged, iconic figure who had just been convicted of 7 felonies for taking unreported gifts, in a very close and protracted election result in mid-November 2008. Career after leaving the Senate of his 1980 defeat, ɡrəʻvɛl later recalled, "I had lost my career. I lost my marriage. I was in the doldrums for 10 years after my defeat, and nobody wanted to hire me for anything important. I felt like I was worthless. I didn't know what I could do." By his own description in 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl was a womanizer, and had an affair while in the Senate, and in December 1980 he and his wife Rita separated. They filed for divorce in September 1981. She would later get all of his Senate pension income. During the 1980s, ɡrəʻvɛl was a real estate developer in Anchorage and Kenai, Alaska, a consultant, and a stockbroker. One of his real estate ventures, a condominium business, was forced to declare bankruptcy and a lawsuit ensued. In 1986, ɡrəʻvɛl worked in partnership with Merrill Lynch Capital Markets to buy losses that financially troubled Alaska Native corporations could not take as tax deductions and sell them to large national companies looking for tax write-offs. In 1984, ɡrəʻvɛl married his second wife, Whitney Stewart ɡrəʻvɛl, a former administrative assistant for Senator Jacob Javits. Returned to politics in 1989, ɡrəʻvɛl re-entered politics. He founded and led the Democracy Foundation, which promotes direct democracy. He established the Philadelphia II Corporation, which seeks to replicate the original 1787 Constitutional Convention in bringing direct democracy about. ɡrəʻvɛl led a quixotic effort to get a United States constitutional amendment to allow voter-initiated federal legislation similar to state ballot initiatives. He argued that Americans are able to legislate responsibly, and that the act and amendment in the national initiative would allow American citizens to become lawmakers. In 2001, ɡrəʻvɛl became director of the Alexis de Tocqueville Institution, where he admired Institute co-founder Gregory Fossadal's work on direct democracy in Switzerland. By 2004, ɡrəʻvɛl had become chair of the institute, and Fossadal gave the introduction at ɡrəʻvɛl's presidential announcement. In 2003, ɡrəʻvɛl gave a speech on direct democracy at a conference hosted by the American Free Press. The event was co-sponsored by the Barnes Review, a journal that endorses Holocaust denial. After some controversy over his appearance, ɡrəʻvɛl apologized, saying he did not realize the group's ties. ɡrəʻvɛl has said repeatedly that he does not share the group's views on the Holocaust, stating, "You better believe I know that 6 million Jews were killed. I've been to the Holocaust Museum. I've seen the footage of General Eisenhower touring one of the camps. They're nutty as loons if they don't think it happened." The group invited ɡrəʻvɛl to speak again, but he declined. Mike and Whitney ɡrəʻvɛl lived in Arlington County, Virginia, until 2010 and now reside in Burlingame, California. They have the 2 grown children from his first marriage, Martin ɡrəʻvɛl and Lynn ɡrəʻvɛl Mosier, and 4 grandchildren. Whitney ɡrəʻvɛl's income has sustained the couple since 1998. In the 2000s, ɡrəʻvɛl suffered poor health, requiring 3 surgeries in 2003 for back pain and neuropathy. Due to unreimbursed medical expenses and debts from his political causes, he declared personal bankruptcy in 2004. He began taking a salary from the nonprofit organizations for which he was working. Much of that income was lent to his presidential campaign. In 2007, he declared that he had zero net worth. 2008 presidential campaign Democratic Party primaries. At the start of 2006, ɡrəʻvɛl decided the best way he could promote direct democracy and the national initiative was to run for president. On April 17, 2006, ɡrəʻvɛl became the first candidate for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States in the 2008 election, announcing his run in a speech to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Short on campaign cash, he took public transportation to get to his announcement. Other principal ɡrəʻvɛl positions were the fair tax, withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq within 120 days, a single-payer national health care system, and term limits. ɡrəʻvɛl had opposed the Iraq War from the beginning, and in 2006 said that U.S. troops in Iraq, as in Vietnam, had died in vain. He also favored a regional peace initiative, as well as reparation payments for Iraqis. ɡrəʻvɛl also called for a U.S. corporate withdrawal from Iraq, with reconstruction contracts held by U.S. companies to be turned over to Iraqi firms. ɡrəʻvɛl campaigned almost full-time in New Hampshire, the first primary state, following his announcement. Opinion polls of contenders for the Democratic nomination showed ɡrəʻvɛl with 1% or less support. By the end of March 2007, ɡrəʻvɛl's campaign had less than $500 in cash on hand against debts of nearly $90,000. Because of his time in the Senate, ɡrəʻvɛl was invited to many of the early Democratic presidential debates. During the initial one at South Carolina State University on April 26, 2007, he suggested a bill requiring the president to withdraw from Iraq on pain of criminal penalties. He also advocated positions such as opposing preemptive nuclear war. He stated that the Iraq War had the effect of creating more terrorists and that the war was lost the day that George Bush invaded Iraq on a fraudulent basis. Regarding his fellow candidates, he said, "I got to tell you, after standing up with them, some of these people frighten me, they frighten me." Media stories said that ɡrəʻvɛl was responsible for much of whatever heat and flashpoints had taken place. ɡrəʻvɛl gained considerable publicity by shaking up the normally staid multiple candidate format. The New York Times media critic said that what ɡrəʻvɛl had done was steal a debate with outrageous, curmudgeonly statements. The Internet was a benefit. A YouTube video of his responses in the debate was viewed more than 225,892 times, ranking 17th in most views for week and first among news and politics clips. His name became the 15th most searched for in the blogosphere, and his website garnered more traffic than those of frontrunners Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or John Edwards. ɡrəʻvɛl appeared on the popular Colbert Report on television on May 2, and his campaign and career were profiled in national publications such as Salon. Two wordless, Warholesque campaign videos, Rock and Fire, were released on YouTube in late May and became hits, and eventually gained over 760,000 and 185,000 views respectively. Rock, in turn, was given airtime during an episode of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Some 35 years after he first achieved the national spotlight, he had found it again. All this did not improve his performance in the polls. A May 2007 CNN poll showed him with less than 0.5% support among Democrats. ɡrəʻvɛl was in the next several debates, in one case after CNN reversed a decision to exclude him. Like some of the other second-tier candidates, ɡrəʻvɛl did not get as much time as the leaders. During the June 2, 2007, New Hampshire debate, which lasted 2 hours, he was asked 10 questions and allowed to speak for 5 minutes and 37 seconds. During the July 23, 2007, CNN YouTube presidential debate, ɡrəʻvɛl responded to audience applause when he had complained of a lack of airtime and said, "Thank you. Has it been fair thus far?" Detractors began to liken him to the cranky uncle who lives in the attic, or the angry old guy that just seemed to want to become angrier. Berkeley political scientist David Turr found that moderator George Stephanopoulos directed roughly 5% of his questions to ɡrəʻvɛl. In a poll asking who did the best in the debate, ɡrəʻvɛl placed 7th among the 8 candidates. National opinion polls of contenders for the Democratic nomination continued to show ɡrəʻvɛl with 1% or 0% numbers. By the end of the third quarter 2007, ɡrəʻvɛl had about $17,500 in cash on hand, had collected a total of about $380,000 during the 2008 election cycle, and was continuing to run a threadbare campaign with minimal staff. Beginning with the October 30, 2007, Philadelphia event, ɡrəʻvɛl was excluded from most of the debates, with the debate sponsors or the Democratic National Committee saying ɡrəʻvɛl's campaign had not met fundraising, polling, or local campaign organizational thresholds. For the Philadelphia exclusion, ɡrəʻvɛl blamed corporate censorship on the part of sponsor-owner and alleged military-industrial complex member General Electric for his exclusion, and mounted a counter-gathering and debate against a video screen a short distance away, but he had lost his easiest publicity. In reaction, supporters organized mass donation days to try to help the campaign gain momentum and funds, such as on December 5, 2007, the anniversary of the repeal of prohibition. ɡrəʻvɛl did not compete in the initial 2008 vote, the Iowa caucuses, but was still subjected to a false report from MSNBC that he had pulled out of the race afterward. ɡrəʻvɛl did focus his attention on the second 2008 vote, the New Hampshire primary. There he received about 400 votes out of some 280,000 cast, or 0.14%, before taking time off to improve his health. He resumed campaigning, but fared no better in subsequent states. By the end of January 2008, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and ɡrəʻvɛl were the only remaining Democrats from the initial debates still running. ɡrəʻvɛl vowed to stay in the presidential campaign until November. On March 11, 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl continued to remain in the Democratic race but additionally endorsed a Green Party candidate for president, Jesse Johnson, saying he wanted to help Johnson prevail against Green Party rivals Cynthia McKinney and Ralph Nader. By late March, ɡrəʻvɛl had almost no fundraising and was only on the ballot in one of the next 10 Democratic primaries. Switched to Libertarian Party on March 25, 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl announced that he would leave the Democrats and join the Libertarian Party, saying, "My libertarian views, as well as my strong stance against war, the military-industrial complex and American imperialism, seem not to be tolerated by Democratic Party elites who are out of touch with the average American, elites that reject the empowerment of American citizens." I offered to the Democratic Party at the beginning of this presidential campaign with the National Initiative for Democracy. The following day ɡrəʻvɛl entered the race for the 2008 Libertarian presidential nomination, saying that he would have run as a third-party candidate all along except that he needed the public exposure that came from being in the earlier Democratic debates. ɡrəʻvɛl's initial notion of running as a fusion candidate with other parties was met with skepticism and not pursued. As a Libertarian candidate, ɡrəʻvɛl faced resistance to his liberal past and unorthodox positions. Nevertheless, he garnered more support than he had as a Democrat, placing second and third in 2 April 2008 straw polls. In the May 25 balloting at the 2008 Libertarian National Convention in Denver, ɡrəʻvɛl finished fourth out of 8 candidates on the initial ballot, with 71 votes out of a total 618. He trailed former Congressman and eventual winner Bob Barr, author Mary Ruwart, and businessman Wayne Allen Root. ɡrəʻvɛl's position did not subsequently improve and he was eliminated on the fourth ballot. Afterwards he stated that, "I just ended my political career," but he vowed to continue promoting his positions as a writer and lecturer. 2008 Early 2019 In June 2008 ɡrəʻvɛl endorsed the NYC 9/11 ballot initiative, saying the measure would create a «citizens commission» rather than a government commission, with subpoena power against top U.S. officials to «make a true investigation as to what happened» regarding the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. He later said, "Individuals in and out of government may certainly have participated with the obviously known perpetrators of this dastardly act. Suspicions abound over the analysis presented by government. Obviously an act that has triggered 3 wars, Afghan, Iraqi and the continuing war on terror, should be extensively investigated, which was not done and which the government avoids addressing." In August 2008 ɡrəʻvɛl was speaking to a crowd of supporters of Sami al-Arian when he was caught on tape saying of al-Arian's prosecutor, "Find out where he lives, find out where his kids go to school, find out where his office is, picket him all the time. Call him a racist in signs if you see him. Call him an injustice. Call him whatever you want to call him, but in his face all the time." ɡrəʻvɛl was criticized for potentially involving the children of the prosecutor, and al-Arian's family disavowed the sentiments. ɡrəʻvɛl defended Alaska Governor Sarah Palin after she was chosen as Republican presidential nominee John McCain's running mate in September 2008. He praised Palin's record in standing up to corruption among Alaskan Republicans, thought her national inexperience was an asset not a detriment, and predicted that the Troopergate investigation into whether she improperly fired a state official would come out in her favor. ɡrəʻvɛl made clear he would not support or vote for either McCain-Palin or Obama-Biden in the general election. The following year ɡrəʻvɛl said that Palin's politics were terrible, but that doesn't detract from the fact that she's a very talented person. He predicted that Palin would run for president in 2012 and that she's going to surprise a lot of people. Palin did not run, but ɡrəʻvɛl's prediction about Troopergate was accurate as Palin was found not to have violated ethics laws. From mid-2008 through October 2009 ɡrəʻvɛl gave several lectures at South Korean universities about the Korean National Initiative, a Korean adaptation of the National Initiative ɡrəʻvɛl has proposed in the United States. In December 2010 ɡrəʻvɛl praised WikiLeaks, in the news during the year for the Afghan War Documents leak, Iraq War Documents leak, and United States diplomatic cables leak, as the most significant effort to save democracy since the release of the Pentagon Papers. ɡrəʻvɛl indicated in December 2010 that he might run for president again and possibly challenge President Obama for the Democratic nomination for the 2012 presidential election, but he did not. In 2013, ɡrə́vɛl attended the International Conference on Hollywoodism in Tehran, Iran, an Iranian government-organized anti-Hollywood conference. ɡrə́vɛl noted that the conference was attended by various elements of extremes but said it was necessary to discuss how the U.S. film industry portrayed Iran in order to prevent an insane war between the two nations. In May 2013, ɡrə́vɛl was one of several former members of Congress to accept $20,000 from the Paradigm Research Group, an advocacy group for UFO disclosure, as part of holding what they termed a citizen hearing on disclosure, modeled after congressional hearings, regarding supposed U.S. government suppression of evidence concerning UFOs. ɡrə́vɛl said, "Something is monitoring the planet, and they are monitoring it very cautiously, because we are a very warlike planet, and, what we're faced with here is, in areas of the media, and the government too, an effort to marginalize and ridicule people who have specific knowledge." In December 2014, ɡrə́vɛl was announced as the new CEO of Kush, a company which makes marijuana-infused products for medicinal and recreational use, and a subsidiary of Cannabis Sativa, Inc. He also became an independent director of Cannabis Sativa. During the 2016 Democratic presidential primaries, ɡrə́vɛl praised Bernie Sanders and his campaign, saying, "Bernie is one of the most gifted politicians I have ever observed. He's a person of great integrity and very clever." ɡrə́vɛl predicted that Sanders would be elected president but would be unable to get his key reforms through Congress, and thus that Sanders and his supporters should back some of the proposals of the National Initiative. ɡrə́vɛl has gone further in conspiratorial thinking in relation to the September 11 attacks, saying in 2016 on a conspiracies-oriented radio program, "We killed 58,000 American servicemen in the Vietnam War and all they did was die in vain. What's so unusual about killing 3,000 more in order to develop the grist for the mill to empower into infinity the military-industrial complex?" The remarks were later disavowed by even ɡrə́vɛl supporters. In 2019 it was reported that ɡrə́vɛl is working on a book project to highlight his principal idea for direct democracy, an U.S. constitutional amendment to bring into being a legislature of the people that would circumvent a dysfunctional Congress. 2020 presidential campaign. On March 19, 2019, ɡrə́vɛl announced that he was considering running in the 2020 Democratic primaries. He said, "The goal will not be to win, but to bring a critique of American imperialism to the Democratic debate stage." An exploratory committee was formed, with filing a statement of organization with the Federal Election Commission on that same day. The filing was the idea of a group of teenagers inspired by the podcast Chapo Trap House, and done with ɡrə́vɛl's consent, but without his involvement. Intrigued by the group's commitment to amplifying his long-held policy goals, ɡrə́vɛl said he planned to meet with them in April, and to discuss a 2020 White House run with his wife. On April 2, 2019, ɡrə́vɛl filed to officially run for office. The campaign called itself the #ɡrə́vɛlaunch. ɡrə́vɛl's initial stated goal was merely to qualify for debates by getting the required 65,000 small donors. He discouraged people from voting for him and said his preferences were Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom favor a non-interventionist foreign policy. But on April 29, ɡrə́vɛl's campaign said he was running to win, not just to participate in debates. In a subsequent interview, though, ɡrə́vɛl emphasized the virtue of Sanders and Gabbard in some order as a presidential ticket. Statements like these caused Vox to call ɡrə́vɛl 2020's oddest Democratic presidential candidate. In June 2019, ɡrə́vɛl touted the endorsement of Muntadhir al-Zaidi, the Iraqi journalist who, in December 2008, made headlines after he threw his shoes at President George W. Bush in protest of the U.S. war in Iraq. Al-Zaidi endorsed ɡrə́vɛl based on his promise to improve White House policies regarding Iraq and the Middle East. On June 13, 2019, the Democratic Party announced the 20 major candidates who qualified for the first debate later that month. ɡrə́vɛl was one of the 4 who missed out. He had failed to get the requisite number of donations or to score 1% or better in enough polls. Indeed, he failed to reach that threshold in any poll, many of which did not include him. Nor did ɡrə́vɛl do well on social media. One Axios Newswhip ranking placed him next to last in social media interactions, ahead of only Messam. Nevertheless, ɡrə́vɛl said he would not drop out and would try to qualify for the July debate. In early July, however, ɡrə́vɛl's campaign said it was still 10,000 contributions short of the 65,000 donor threshold and that it was nearing its conclusion. It solicited suggestions for where to donate $100 minus $150,000 of leftover campaign funds. ɡrə́vɛl added that he had always planned on ending the campaign before the teenagers in charge of it needed to return to school. A few days later, the campaign became the first to run an attack ad against Democratic front-runner Joe Biden, using the text, "Is this the best our party has to offer?" ɡrə́vɛl's campaign crossed the threshold of 65,000 donors on July 12, 2019, qualifying him for that month's debate. But because 20 other candidates, the maximum allowed to participate, had already met at least the polling criterion, which takes priority over the donor criterion, ɡrə́vɛl was not invited. As a result, he ended his campaign on July 31. Political positions Alan Abramowitz and Jeffrey Allen Siegel described ɡrə́vɛl as a maverick, if not an eccentric. In the Senate, his Americans for Democratic Action liberal quotient scores ranged from 81 out of 100 to 39 out of 100, with an average of around 61. His American Conservative Union scores ranged from 0 out of 100 to 38 out of 100, with an average of 14. Abramowitz and Siegel note that ɡrə́vɛl's lowest data ratings coincided with his two Senate re-election bids, and for the most part his highest ACU ratings followed the same pattern. In 1972, as a young senator, ɡrə́vɛl published Citizen Power, a people's platform, a manifesto outlining his populist reform proposals. Social issues on drug policy. ɡrə́vɛl said in 2007 that he favors decriminalization and treating addiction as a public health matter. During his 2008 presidential candidacy, he condemned the war on drugs as a failure, saying that it did nothing but savage our inner cities and put our children at risk. ɡrə́vɛl called for abolition of capital punishment in his book Citizen Power, and adhered to this position during his 2008 run for president. He supports abortion rights. During the 2008 campaign, ɡrə́vɛl was a strong supporter of LGBT rights. He supported same-sex marriage and opposed the Defense of Marriage Act and the U.S. military's "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy. He wrote in 2008 that depriving gays and lesbians of equal rights is immoral. Foreign policy and defense issues. ɡrə́vɛl is a critic of American imperialism. ɡrə́vɛl firmly opposes U.S. military action against Iran and Syria. He voiced opposition to the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, the Military Commissions Act of 2006, the use of torture, indefinite detention, and what he called flagrant ignorance of the Geneva Convention. In 2014, ɡrə́vɛl called for the release of the full, unredacted Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture. ɡrə́vɛl opposes the use of international sanctions as a policy tool and blamed the ones against Iraq under Saddam Hussein for the deaths of 500,000 children in that country. In 2013, ɡrə́vɛl said that sanctions against Iran were illegal. During his 2008 candidacy, ɡrə́vɛl called for a cut in military spending, variously reported to be 15% or 50%. He called for the savings to boost public education spending. To spur international nuclear nonproliferation efforts, ɡrə́vɛl called for unilateral reductions in the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In 2008, ɡrə́vɛl criticized the decision of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to not pursue the efforts to impeach George W. Bush and the attempted impeachment of Dick Cheney, saying also that Bush and Cheney had committed crimes and deserved to be prosecuted at The Hague. In 2013, he expressed disdain for President Obama, calling him a total fraud and saying that both Bush and Obama should be tried for the crimes and murders they've committed in the International Court of Justice. ɡrə́vɛl specifically condemned Obama for the drone strikes in Pakistan and elsewhere. Economy, immigration, and environment. During his 2008 candidacy, ɡrə́vɛl favored a progressive fair tax scheme, which would abolish the Internal Revenue Service, eliminate the federal income tax, and impose a national sales tax. To offset the new sales taxes on essential goods, ɡrə́vɛl's plan called for monthly government rebate payments to individuals and families. During his 2020 campaign, ɡrə́vɛl also voiced support for a third legislative body that would give the people direct control of the budget as well as the implementation of a land value tax. ɡrə́vɛl opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement during his 2008 candidacy, calling it unfair and economically harmful and needing renegotiation. ɡrəʻvɛl believed that NAFTA was the root cause of illegal migration to the U.S. He favored a guest worker program and setting up naturalization procedures that would fairly bring immigrants into legal status. In a 2007 interview, ɡrəʻvɛl identified himself as very much of a globalist who believed in open markets and open borders and condemned the scapegoating of undocumented immigrants. ɡrəʻvɛl also said that he favored eliminating the cap on H-1B visas. As a senator from Alaska, ɡrəʻvɛl favored drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but during his 2008 campaign opposed it. In 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl supported a carbon tax to combat climate change. ɡrəʻvɛl spoke in favor of net neutrality during his presidential campaign. Education and health care. ɡrəʻvɛl called for the cost of college tuition to be borne by the federal government, rather than students. In his 2008 campaign, he called the No Child Left Behind Act a failure and called for it to be reformed and fully funded. He expressed support for universal pre-kindergarten and the expansion of the Head Start program, and expressed an openness to charter schools and school vouchers. He also suggested extending the school day and the school year, and supported merit pay for teachers. ɡrəʻvɛl also called for publicly funded universal health care to replace the current employer-sponsored health insurance system. He supported full funding of the VA system. When asked in 2007 about naturopathy, homeopathy, and acupuncture, ɡrəʻvɛl said that he was totally in favor and was very much in favor of holistic health care. Civil rights. In 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl opposed federal affirmative action programs and affirmative action in public college admissions and government contracting decisions. Awards and honors. In 2008, ɡrəʻvɛl received the Columbia University School of General Studies' first annual Isaac Asimov Lifetime Achievement Award. Electoral history. Writings. Notes.